and welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast, the show that aims to reduce the innovation to implementation gap to 16 and a half years. I'm your host, Mike Pullmann, and on today's show, co-host Kevin King will interview me. Apologies in advance to anyone who's tired of hearing us talk about our work. Honestly, your time might be better spent watching old reruns of Webster. But if you do stick around, we'll talk about equity in education, the unintended consequences of implementation strategies, the ethics and obligations of conducting community-based research, and then Kevin will quiz me on my knowledge of rock climbing. I think you're really going to suffer through today's show. Without further ado, let's get started.
All right, folks, welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast. I'm your co-host, Kevin King. Our glorious and illustrious host, Mike Pullmann, is out on vacation, so I'm here solo doing an interview today with our special guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Mike Pullmann.
What switcheroo, everyone. We're super happy today to have Mike Pullmann, PhD, as our guest, and I'm going to be interviewing Mike solo, so wish me luck. Let me start with a brief introduction. Mike Pullmann leads the Smart Center data analytic core. He's also part of, actually, what the fuck, where do you work? Tell me what you want to work. I just pulled this from your website. I have a bio.
Sure, man. Sure, yeah. No, I'm a methodologist. I work at several centers. So I'm at the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center at the University of Washington. I'm also at the University of Washington Alacrity Center, or UWAC. And I'm also at the University of Washington Impact Center, which isn't an acronym. I just freshly got off of the University of Washington Optics Center. I am also part of the University of Washington Creative Lab, where we study digital mental health. And I feel like there's one more center, and I'm blanking on it. So we'll come back to that.
That's all right. Now, the real question is the center that you're not thinking of, is it an acronym or not an acronym? So I think we're 50-50 so far.
Right. I feel like it is an acronym. All right, I'm gonna come back to this.
That's all right. So I just pulled this from your website. So Mike's research is focused on community-based and participatory approaches in cross-system collaborative efforts to serve youth and families with complex needs, with an emphasis on education and mental health. He also conducts research on racial and ethnic disproportionality in discipline and the commercial sex trafficking of minors. He provides methodological leadership on multiple projects within the Smart Center with a particular interest, and I would add, across all centers that he works with, acronyms or not, with a particular interest in illuminating the impact of policy decisions through longitudinal approaches to data analysis of large-scale administrative databases, and on a smaller scale, implementation and dissemination efforts. His latest efforts have focused on identifying the possible unforeseen consequences and outcomes associated with implementation strategies. Mike, I'm super happy to be doing this interview with you today. I've known you for over a decade, and I have to say I still don't know anything about the research that you do, because every time you start talking to me about it, I just kind of tune out.
Yeah.
So here is a good, well, we scheduled an hour, but we spent the first 10 minutes talking about other things in our lives, which we will not be airing today on the podcast. So we now have 48 minutes to learn everything there is to know about everything you've ever done in your career. So let's go fast.
That should be more than sufficient.
Right. I figure we'll go for about 15 minutes, and then we can just spend the rest of the time bullshitting. So
yeah. And hang on, you said that you tune out whatever I'm working on, and it's funny. I must do the same thing, because when you read that that bio of me, I'm like, man, I need to update that. There's some things I'm not working on anymore there, and there's new things I'm working on too. So yeah,
that is the bane of putting a bio on a website, because then that website stays there for eternity, and the only time you update it is when you're confronted with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to figure out a way to have dynamic biographies, or just ban them from the internet entirely. So Mike, let's start at the beginning. Tell our audience about your background and training. You, for example, were trained as a community psychologist. Now, I looked up in preparation for this interview, I looked up community psychologist in Webster's dictionary, and all I got was an error page. So my first question is, how dare you imitate a real psychologist, Mike?
Yeah.
How dare you? No, for real. How dare you? As a follow-up to that, tell us, what is community psychology? Tell us about your training in community psychology.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I'm not actually a community psychologist. Really, it all goes back to fourth grade. Miss Nancy Jacobs, my math teacher. Oh, no, no, no.
Dum
Actually, that was
dum
somebody else.
dum.
I do want to go back to I got my master's degree at Portland State University. So I had been working after I got my undergraduate degree, I was working at a residential treatment center. I did that for a year and a half. It's the hardest job I've ever had. I think I made $8.25 an hour. And then I went to get my master's degree. While I was doing that, actually, I worked at a Montessori school as a substitute teacher. It was a very different experience between this residential treatment center and the Montessori school. And I think really I learned some things that I think are really important in terms of what I brought to my research. And maybe we'll circle back to that later. But I got my master's degree at Portland State University, and then I got hired as a research coordinator there. And I stuck around there for 6 years working on systems of care research as a program evaluator. So at the Regional Research Institute, I was under the tutelage of Dr. Nancy Korloff and Barbara Friesen, and they were both in the School of Social Work. And they were incredibly dedicated to participatory action research and to community-based participatory research. I had never heard these terms before, and frankly, while I worked for them, I never heard those terms then either. Instead of talking about the theory, instead of using, $10
Mm.
words to illustrate what it was they were doing. They just went out and did the work. They
Mm.
hired members of the community. They were completely passionate about not stigmatizing anyone, not labeling anyone. So we hired caregivers of children that had serious emotional disturbances, which is what we called it back then, to work on these mental health projects with us as full, like, collaborative partners.
Mm.
And I was kind of thrown into this after having a master's degree in psychology, which, if we frankly think about it, like, psychology, especially back in the late 90s, was largely focused on labeling people
Right,
and
exactly.
contributing to stigma and really blaming parents for the emotional problems that their children were having, rather than thinking about ways to support parents.
Right.
So it was a very, very different paradigm for me, and one that I really grew to love and embrace. And I did a lot of political activism back then. And so I was working with sort of people like in the streets protesting, and the participatory action research, even though I didn't know it was called that, fit in with that really well. And I was lucky enough to then meet Craig Ann Hefflinger at Vanderbilt University, who recruited me to go there for my PhD. And that's where I really got more immersed into, what we call community psychology. The program at Vanderbilt is called Community Research and Action. So actually, it was the Community Research and Action program. So the acronym was CRAP. So I got my PhD in CRAP. None of the
At least you've
faculty.
been consistent throughout your whole career,
Yes,
Mike.
it's true. And none of the faculty within the CRAP program thought that joke was funny at all, but all of the students did.
All of the students.
And at Vanderbilt, it was a very different experience. So actually, Craig Ann was very dedicated as well to really working in the community. But some of the other training I got, I would say, was much more higher level. So that's when I finally got an opportunity to read Paulo Freire and other writers who really focused on the philosophy, oftentimes, of participatory action research, community research and action. And so it was really wonderful to be immersed in that theory. But frankly, I would say Vanderbilt didn't do the best job in the world of actually doing the research. And this is an interesting dichotomy that I've seen in academics. Oftentimes, those people that are sort of held up as the sort of luminaries in the field that do all the writing aren't actually oftentimes doing the work all that well. Again, I wouldn't say this about Craig Ann Hefflinger, that she was wonderful. And I really did appreciate my program. It was great. But it's almost like if you're really, really doing it well, you're not talking about it. And if you're talking about it a lot, oftentimes you're not really, really doing it well.
Yeah, what do you think? Where do you think is the missing link? I think a lot of people can intuitively appreciate that notion, but I also think it's maybe hard to actually grok. Like when you're, if you're doing it really well, what are you doing that theorizers are missing?
Well, I think the Academy rewards people that are able to shout loudest in the echo chamber. You look at what sort of incentives we get for promotion. It's journal article citations, grant proposals, which come from journal article citations, on and on. It's not changing laws. It's not forming community partnerships and helping an organization work better with the participants that it's serving. It's not empowering communities to go out and advocate for their own change. None of those things are rewarded. And so those people who are in the academy and who do it best are not doing oftentimes those things that actually create the most change.
Right. In a
So
way,
I've tried in my career to have some
Mhm.
balance between those two
Mhm.
things.
Yeah, you're kind of making an argument that there's a third variable explanation that people who theorize about the doing, who are able to write about it, get grants to try it out. There may be something about persuasiveness, sort of, yeah, as you said, sort of about shouting it loudest, maybe to be pithy about it, the TED Talkification of research topics where, you often find out that the people who are popular and people who make, sort of write the top pop science books about it, their research is actually not that strong. Sometimes they even turns out they fake their data.
Mm.
I'm not saying about these community, participatory action research people, but just that general phenomenon of sometimes the most famous, well-known people are good at communicating, and maybe that confounds, that's a confound that doesn't actually relate to the quality of the science that they're doing, or in your case, the quality of the intervention and community organizing that's required. What do you think is something that, maybe those luminaries miss? Sort of what do you learn from actually being on the ground, and actually bringing in, community partners and, in your case, the parents of the children with emotional difficulties? What are the things that you feel like sometimes people miss, who don't have that real world experience, or what do you learn when you do get that sort of real world experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say some of the biggest aspects are that sometimes it's our approach to research and evaluation is just a bad fit for the needs of the specific community. We end up in situations where we intentionally or unintentionally guide research questions in directions that are more publishable, but maybe less practical, or we get organizations into situations where they're spending a lot of time collecting a lot of data from their clients, but they don't know how to use that data. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think even we don't know how to use that data in really practical ways. It's like, oh, okay, now I know my clients' demographics and
Mhm.
the basic understanding of how they're maybe changing over time. But what does that mean in terms of what kinds of services I need to provide or how I need to provide them differently?
Mhm.
And oftentimes the real questions that community providers have sometimes aren't answerable within that organization. Oftentimes unanswerable unless you have a really large scale research study. You know what I
Right.
mean? I feel like sometimes there's just a bad fit and that communication can be difficult. And it goes the other way as well. Like I've oftentimes
Mhm.
worked with researchers and had a hard time explaining to them that the specific research question that they're wanting to ask isn't really answerable with the data that we would be able to collect. It's just kind of an unfeasible,
Mhm.
impractical questions. And so, it's not only community partners that struggle with this. I think it goes both ways.
Right. And part of what you implied there, one of the things that you sort of said there that struck me was this idea that of collecting all this data. I'm a methodologist, at least in my second life, and I love lots of data, but I could also see if, data is great for the purposes of publications. Data is great for the purposes of grants. It's great for students to analyze. It's great to sort of theorize and learn things about the world, but I could see just collecting more data is not necessarily good for, community agency or community partner. And I could see, the other thing, the comment that you made that struck me was that sometimes you might want to collect a whole bunch of data that they could never sustain on their own without a big research grant. And that to me strikes as a sort of mismatch of implementation. Like if they need a huge data collection and analysis infrastructure to help them do their jobs better, unless they're sort of a huge organization, there's no way they're going to have that and be able to sustain that anyway. So it's almost like your academic solution is infeasible for
hmm
their world, even if it did meet their goals, which you're
hmm
saying also often it doesn't.
Yeah, that's true. So I work with an organization. I work with several organizations, but I work with one called REST, which is stands for Real Escape from the Sex Trade,
Hmm.
and they got a couple of small grants that I worked with them on to provide additional residential living support services and employment services. And as part of those grants, they're required to collect a bunch of data. So they set up they adapted their existing data system
Hmm.
to add all these surveys size and then longitudinal time points every 3 months. They've bent over backwards to reach out and bring people in. And all this is really great and fit the needs of the evaluation really, really well. But now they're so now the money is gone, but now they have this infrastructure, this data
Right.
infrastructure, and they want to continue that. But the real question they need to ask themselves, and I'm kind of trying to help them with right now, is how do you continue that in a way that's actually there's some cost effectiveness there?
Right.
Like, are you throwing money at something that just happens to exist that maybe isn't useful for you anymore, or maybe it is, and how do we get to a point to make it useful? What extra money do we need to put into it to get to a point where it's useful? And I'm a little chagrined as well because I know I've kind of played a part in this machine,
Right.
and I'm hoping I haven't put them down, steered them down the wrong path, and that just needs to emerge via conversations with them about what's important to them. But yeah.
Right. Right. So again, it's that interchange between the researcher and the agency, figuring out what are their goals and how do you help them reach their goals that are important to them without superimposing your own on top of that. Sounds like that sounds like a sort of a core value of you and the research that you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of your lines of research has to do with disproportionality in school discipline. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I haven't been working on that nearly as much recently, but I wish this got a little bit more attention. We tried to get some funding for this, and it is a little bit weird, I have to admit, to be, a white man in this field. I've worked on racial and ethnic disproportionality issues for years and years and years. I think probably like even when I was working my doctoral program, I worked with the state of Tennessee on their it was called Disproportionate Minority Contact Committee in juvenile justice. And even going back to Portland State University, as when I was a research coordinator there, we produced some research around racial and ethnic disproportionality. But like in school discipline, like this just goes back decades and decades, really massive disparities between white youth and students of color in, the numbers of kids, proportion of kids that are being sent to the office and punished for different infractions. So in working with Clay Cook and Eric Bruns and Aaron Lyon and Mylene Duong was a massive influence in this project. We got an IES or Institute of Education Sciences grant to develop a partnership with Seattle Public Schools. And out of that partnership, we developed a number of tools. One of the most important tools that came out of that project was ultimately something that we called the DDAS, or the Disparities in Discipline Assessment for Schools tool. And what we did is we identified multiple evidence-based reasons why, or determinants of disproportionate in discipline. I guess in the implementation field, we would call these determinants. So these are things like parent-teacher-student relationships, data-based decision-making, school-based policies, teachers' level of use of proactive and reactive disciplinary techniques. And we developed this really awesome tool that schools could use and then determine, okay, so like we're high in these levels, low in these levels. And then we developed a menu that they could then look at after assessing themselves. And from that menu, they could choose from a number of evidence-based interventions. Now, that's promising actually a little bit more than actually exists, because frankly, there's not a lot of really good evidence-based interventions to reduce racial and ethnic disproportionality in discipline. But our theory was that, okay, if you pick one that's actually fits best with the school needs and with what the school is poised to do, like maybe sometimes low-hanging fruit is the way to go, or where there's political will to approach. That like if you make that fit better between the intervention and the need, that you're actually more likely to impact disproportionality in discipline. Now, we've tried to get funding from IES multiple times, and we finally gave up after our third round to make that tool even better, and then to actually test whether or not it works, and to pull data from schools across the nation to really see whether or not our like multi-factor understanding of the determinants even fits really, really well or not, because we pulled all these factors from a wide variety of different kind of sources. So I was so excited about this and would love to continue working on it. However, like also, I know I'm not going to say this in the right way, So I'm going to try to say this as best I can, and I hope
Yeah.
people kind of understand. Being a white dude in this kind of period of racial reckoning, who has been working on these issues for years and years and years, but also recognizes that I might be taking up space
Hmm.
in an area that maybe I should be playing more of a supportive role and less of a leadership role. That has been sort of striking me more and more and has actually led me to kind of like focus less and less on this,
Hmm.
unless I think somebody came in and wanted to lead it and then I could support them.
I don't know, Mike. I always feel like people appreciate when white men step up on behalf of and sort of really take the lead with our experiences as an oppressed minority.
Hmm.
No,
Hmm.
I think you said that really well. I fully appreciate that, our identity. I think I can just say as a white man, the notion that my identity is important and to think about sort of my positionality. I feel like I'm playing catch up. I guess I'm saying I've grown to appreciate that so much more in recent years, and I think that's a completely reasonable stance to take, to sort of think, hey, maybe I should step back. Maybe I can be a cheerleader and support other people doing this work. We can be often blind to our biases and not know, even with all good intentions, and I think you clearly here have the best of intentions. Sometimes that doesn't matter, or sometimes that could still leave us, open to blind spots and sort of, maybe it's helpful to support and cheerlead other people. Let me ask you though, you did a bunch of work with this, from my understanding, in with public schools. What have you learned? Maybe just in general, what have you learned from working with public school systems? Towards, I guess in general, about what are effective and ineffective ways to, make improvements in children's well-being.
Yeah. I'm wondering exactly how strong I should be with my language here, and I think I'm going to be really strong. They say that the classic quote for public schools is that it's the great equalizer, right?
Hmm.
But I would say that's completely false. Uh, and that it's actually the great reifier. Like public schools
Mm.
exist to continue the inequitable system that we have. And that's as
Hmm.
easy as, you could walk into Seattle Public School here in the South End and just look around in terms of the paint job, the building infrastructure, what sorts of before school and after school activities are available, and even oftentimes like teacher experience and expertise,
Hmm.
and then walk into a school out at like Mercer Island
Hmm.
and look around. And it is completely different. It's two completely different systems. And if you do a ranking, which I've done, if you look at
Hmm.
the average house price and the average ranking of the school, it's 1 to 1. Like the best
Hmm.
schools supposedly are in the richest areas. It should be the opposite, really, in terms
Right.
of what kids need. Like those kids in the poorest neighborhoods should have the best facilities, because they need it the most.
Right.
And yet it's not that way. And I think oftentimes kids are set up to experience and expect that they will not get the highest quality treatment. And there's no way that they can't internalize that. Of course, that happens. Or the other way around, people expect that privilege when they grow up in schools that provide that kind of wealth.
Hmm. You know,
Um, so I think those are some of the major drastic things.
yeah,
And we see it too. You can also, like in Seattle Public Schools itself, you can look at the proportion of students that receive free and reduced price lunch and the proportion of students that pass their standardized tests. And it's like 1 to 1. I think we actually did this a while back, and the correlation at a school level, not at
yeah.
an individual student level, and that's really important to keep in
Hmm.
mind. But at the school level, I think the correlation was like 0.9. You don't get those kinds of correlations in social sciences,
Right. You mean the
but it's
correlation
almost a 1 to 1
between
between
proportion of free and
percentage
reduced
of
lunch and
kids
house
who
light?
are have free and
Hmm.
reduced lunch and the proportion of kids who are passing, or I guess
Oh.
failing their standardized tests
Hmm.
that they take. Yeah.
Right. And just for our listeners, who might not live in the Seattle area, Mercer Island is one of our richer schools, or richer school districts in the area, and the south end of Seattle, is one of the lower income areas. Also, probably not coincidentally, due to historic redlining and historic and structural racism, also one
Absolutely.
of the more
Absolutely.
one of the neighborhoods and areas of Seattle where there's more children of color.
Yeah, yeah. And it is weird to me too. I don't know when school busing ended. I haven't looked into this, when
Hmm.
desegregation ended, because we've just, at some point, we've given up on this as a society about desegregation. And
Hmm.
and again, it's de facto desegregation or de facto
Right.
segregation, right? And that's really what we see here. And you look at the schools and it's exactly that way.
Let's go into a new topic. Lately, you've been really interested in this idea of unforeseen consequences of implementation strategies. You're calling them ripple effects in your research. What led you to start pursuing this idea?
Yeah, no, so I love the idea of ripple effects, which are unintended consequences. They can be positive or negative.
Mhm.
And they're also the way we define ripple effects, they're specific types of unintended consequences that can
Mhm.
also be outcomes that are more important to people other than the specific implementer, researcher, or client who's receiving the service, right? So
Mhm.
maybe like a caregiver of a child who has mental health
Mhm.
issues rather than the child themselves or whatever. And so they're outcomes that come in from basically different perspectives or that were never expected to occur in the first place. And again, they can be positive, negative, or even neutral.
Can you give some
Um,
examples?
yeah, so some examples that we have. One of the most commonly kind of talked about examples is when you implement like measurement-based care systems, right?
Mhm.
So maybe you're rewarding mental health providers, or at least maybe not even rewarding, but providing providers with a tool so that they can see how their clients are doing across specific areas. Now, you can only measure certain areas, so maybe you're just measuring the PHQ, like a
Mhm.
depression measure. Well, we found that that can result in what we call like a myopic view of clients, that they're only
Mhm.
laser focused on that one outcome,
Mhm.
when clients usually come in with a broad array of outcomes and
Right.
problems that they're facing. And so that's a common ripple effect that's talked about. That really anything, we say it's nice, anything that gets measured gets done, right?
Right.
But maybe that means that things that aren't measured aren't getting done.
Right.
And it's prioritizing sometimes what may be like dozens of important things to look at, but it's only prioritizing a few things. That's a classic ripple effect that
Mhm. And
happens.
only because, again, because you're measuring it, you're focusing in too much and just sort of forgetting to, zoom out to the broader
Yeah,
picture.
yeah. And
Uh,
let me give you an example
yeah.
of, of a positive ripple effect. Let's say you teach a client or work with a client about relaxation or
Hmm.
about cognitive reframing. We actually know this happens from client reports. They'll go out and teach that to their parents
Hmm.
or their friends or whoever. And so you have a ripple effect and these are actually specifically called spillover effects and has been
Hmm.
documented in the research, where you have like an intervention that actually results in a nice impact on other people who weren't the intended recipient of that intervention.
Now, if I understand correctly, this took a little while for you to get this kind of research off the ground. What do you think it took in terms of to convince people that this was something worth studying?
Well, it is an interesting story. And it didn't take a while, actually. We got funded really well, highly on the first round, and then it like went right away.
Okay.
But there was initially a little bit of pushback from our funders before it was reviewed, who felt that they didn't, especially in the political climate at the time, which was, this was during the Trump presidency, they felt that they didn't want to fund anything that might imply that there are unintended consequences of their funding.
Hmm.
And I can
Yeah.
understand that. They were really afraid about the sort of the political fallout that might
Yeah.
result from this. And I can understand that, sure. As a scientist and sort of a rational thinker, I want to believe that like these won't, our findings wouldn't be used for sort of nefarious political purposes, but that would be an unintended consequence, ironically, of our
Ironically.
research. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I recall early in my training, it was drilled into me that you never, ever, ever want your research to end up being spoken about on the floor of Congress because it's almost never a good thing when that happens. So,
Yes, yes.
in my own career studying alcohol and drug abuse, I probably will never write a paper saying, "Hey, it turns out marijuana is probably pretty good for you, and we shouldn't really worry about it." Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Well,
know,
it's always funny when they come out with, I can't even remember what it's called, but Congress every year, right-wing
hmm.
members of Congress come out with some like, here's the awards for stupid studies, and they
Yes.
cite them. But I always love, there's oftentimes counter reactions where people go into it and look at the specific details for each one and describe it in a paragraph instead of a headline.
Right.
And you're like, oh no, actually that makes sense to fund that. And that one
Right.
makes sense to fund that. And that would
Right.
make, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's rare that they're coming up with actual instances of research waste,
Yeah.
fraud, or abuse.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So what are some of the interesting things you've learned from this research about ripple effects? What are some of the things you've uncovered so far? And then also, where is this going, do you think?
Yeah, so a lot of this work was really just trying to set a foundation for a communication, or I'm sorry, a conversation within implementation science
Hmm.
to really just try to heighten awareness of this. What I'd really love is for interventionists and researchers when they're planning implementations to um, think about possible ripple effects, to put that into their logic model, their theory of change, their causal
Hmm.
pathway diagram, whatever you want to
Hmm.
call it,
Hmm.
for the initial sort of implementation planning that they're doing. And we actually have a website too. It's specific to mental health services, but I think it would be useful for people of all types to just look at. The website is departments, actually depts.washington.edu/ripple effects. And on this website, what's kind of cool about it is that we've built a tool, and actually there's still a couple things I needed to fix the tool. But we've built a tool where if you're planning to do a study, you can walk through it and you can click on what type of implementation strategy you're going to be using, and you can click on the roles that you're most interested in possibly having ripple effects occur to them. So therapists, policymakers, caregivers, youth clients. And you then get to see what possible ripple effects may occur for those roles, for those implementation strategies, based solely on the brainstormed opinions of the participants in
Hmm.
our study. Now,
That's
I
still very cool,
recognize
though.
there's a lot of weaknesses here. Like there are a ton of weaknesses here. But the idea is that this is a thinking tool, right? This isn't saying these ripple effects are definitely going to occur, et
Hmm.
cetera. This is saying that if you're going to be doing collaboration with advisory boards and work groups, or EBP's implementation in a novel setting, or mandating change, that these are the possible ripple effect categories and then the possible specific ripple effects that may occur. So in this case, it may be that, by doing collaboration with advisory
Hmm.
groups, that you are actually improving the client's actual skills in using EBPIs, or their confidence and self-efficacy in using
Hmm.
EBPIs, which is probably not something that like you would normally like try to be impacting
Right.
wanting that.
So it's
Yeah.
almost like giving people a menu of things to be thinking about
To be thinking
when
about
they're
exactly. Yeah.
planning. All
Yeah.
right. Um, So let's shift gears again. You've been a
Sure.
methodologist
Yeah.
for many people's projects for many years. In fact, there have been many times where I've benefited because you were too busy and somebody to help them with their data analysis or give them advice on data
Second
analysis.
best, oh,
And they
second best.
always hiring me as second best. Yes. So maybe you could tell our audience the path that you took to become this. You're both an impressive and important substantive researcher, but you're also sort of methodologist gun for hire. Tell us about the path that led you here.
Oh man. I don't know the path that led me here. That's a good question. I don't love solely being in a leadership role. I don't have sharp elbows. I like
Mhm.
collaborating with fun people who have interesting and creative ideas and bringing my own creative and fun and interesting ideas to the table. I don't have that type A kind of personality
Mhm.
necessarily. I guess I have the type A part of the personality, the anxiety part, but not the like forcing, hopefully not forcing
Yeah.
my own sort of way on others. And so it's just kind of fun. It's just a fun thing to do, to like work with others and to think about methods. I love research. I love trying to think about ways that we can answer interesting questions in a feasible manner. And so it's just kind of, I don't know, I've just kind of fallen into that. It's never been anything that was intentional.
Yeah.
Probably sprang out of some of my early work as a program evaluator, frankly, where
Mhm.
you're working again with community partners and helping them think about
Mhm.
methods to answer their questions. It's like, okay, now I'll work with researchers and help them think about ways to answer their questions.
Well, so thinking about that journey that you've had, what do you do differently now when you work as a methodologist as part of a team than what you did when you started?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think two of the most important things that methodologists need to do, and they seem so basic. The first one is like helping anyone, researchers or community partners, like define their research question in an answerable way. Sometimes people are just so vague. Even PhD level PIs that have decades of experience, I don't know how many times they've asked me a thing, and I'm like, well, but what's your research question? And then they say something, and I'm like, but wait, what's your research question? And then they say something, I'm like, but wait, what's
Yeah.
your research question? And then once they get that research question, I say, well, but what's your logic for that? Like, what's your rationale? Let's draw out a theory
Hmm.
of change. One of the things we're working on right now is actually helping people develop causal pathway
Hmm.
diagrams, which is looking at the mechanisms for
Right.
why an implementation strategy may work. And that kind of approach, also, logic models do the same thing.
Hmm.
That kind of approach, I think, is really, really essential. It's hard to hold all these like multiple things in our minds. And I think oftentimes people have something they want to do, but they don't really have a research question and they don't really know why they want to link it. It's kind of almost like a
Hmm.
random active intervention.
Hmm.
Actually, this led to my like that this unintended consequences stuff too.
Yeah.
Like these random acts of interventions rather than really being thoughtful about the rationale for why you want to do something and why you expect it to have those impacts. And I think it's one of the most important things that any methodologist can do with any PI they're working with.
So that's great. You answered my follow-up question is why do you think people get there? But I think what you're saying is that there are people who sort of, maybe certainly reasonably want to enact change and want to do something. And maybe they get so focused on the doing something that they don't think about sort of, well, okay, how is this going to work? What are we actually trying to target? What are we
Hmm.
actually trying to
Hmm.
affect here?
Well, right. Well, I mean,
Hmm.
I think the reason why we have unintended consequences is we have an innovation bias. I think
Hmm.
everyone
Yeah.
walks in with this, and we need to be really honest about this. And it's why we have things like p hacking, and it's why you know
Hmm.
what I mean? Because everyone walks in, they want to do something, and the reason they want to do it is they think it works. Right.
Right.
But they don't always know why they think it might work. And it can lead to sort of disastrous consequences unless they really begin to break down that rationale.
And you actually answered something I was thinking about earlier today. I was just ruminating on why people are so dismissive of replications or can be so dismissive of replications when to me showing that you can get the same finding twice, whether you're directly replicating or replicating and extending or generalizing, to me it's fascinating because wow, we have more data, we can see this in this other sample of people or with this related measure or boy, just like we have more confirmation with this initial for this initial finding that I would always personally consider tentative. But I think what you're saying is when we have innovation bias, people take the first positive finding as, oh, we learned this and we don't need to learn anything more about it. So we're
Hmm.
done. And so
Hmm.
you showing it again, well, we already knew that.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that I mean that maybe that's putting it a little bit strongly and a little bit in a pithy fashion, but I think that
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense from that
Well,
perspective.
I've said this before on the show. I mean, I do feel like if implementation science cast itself as one aspect of replication science, which I don't
Yeah.
think is a thing, but maybe it is, I think there would be a lot to learn there. I think
Hmm.
oftentimes we feel like, it's like, well, why didn't this implementation work? We had this evidence-based
Hmm.
practice, and we don't oftentimes think of it in terms of like, oh, well, these are replication issues.
Right.
Maybe, and is this a conceptual replication? Is this a direct replication? And those are, I think, important questions to ask, and can really highlight multiple implementation challenges. I think oftentimes instead, people are just walking in saying, "Oh, well, there must be, you know, reason X, Y, or Z from the
Hmm.
CFER,"
Yeah.
rather than considering the broad array of methodological issues that might be at play in any replication.
Hmm. Well, and adopting that, I agree with you. I don't know what field, there's the field of meta science, but that's sort of about studying science. It's sort of not taking the attitudes of replication into your actual science, I think. Although I'm not a replication, I'm not a meta scientist myself. But I think the focus on innovation and the sort of not taking a replicability or a replication perspective where each new study gives us some information also leads us to miss learning opportunities when we do get the same finding again, right? So for us to think about, okay, we think we've found the same finding again. What's the new thing we're learning? I think we're often too dismissive of that. Sort of how do we narrow
Mhm.
our confidence interval, or who do we learn that this works for, or what new thing did we learn? I think it's that old saw that we pay a lot more attention to the methods when we don't get what we expected than when we did. And I think taking the right perspective is we should be interrogating everything the same way, regardless of our findings.
Right.
Now, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to sort of close out with a few fun questions.
Yeah.
What's a paper that you've led recently that you were most proud of?
Oh, I think probably that ripple effects paper that I mentioned earlier that we talked about. This is the website, and then the paper is Expect the Unexpected, a qualitative study of the ripple effects of children's mental health services implementation efforts. And people can go actually on that or look at that paper and see what did we come up with? 66, I think, different possible ripple effects. And I think it's just a fun paper that I hope really helps, like I said, spur the conversation a little bit more.
Fantastic. What's a paper of yours that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but you'll forever think is criminally underappreciated by the field?
Yeah. Or how about a paper that got a lot of attention, but I feel like it's criminally overappreciated? In fact, I'm going to compare and contrast two papers.
Okay, great.
So I did a paper that was just like this one-off summer paper that we had where it's called Barriers to and Supports of Family Participation in a Rural System of Care for Children with Serious Emotional Problems.
And Mental Health Journal,
It's one of my highest cited papers. And it was a fun paper to write. I loved my colleagues that we were on there, but like we literally did qualitative interviews with I think 9 people. And the thing is that anytime I think anyone Google's barriers, rural mental health, this paper comes up, and it's so easy to cite because you look at the abstract and that's got everything you need in there. And then people were like, oh, see, rural mental health people, they have barriers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it has just been cited a million times, probably by 99% of the time by people who haven't actually even read the paper, I would guess, which is really common,
Yeah.
And then I want to contrast that with this other paper I wrote called Effects of Out-of-Home Mental Health Treatment on the Probability of Criminal Charge During the Transition to Adulthood. That paper I love and has been cited 11 times, probably 10 by me. And I think it's my best paper that I've ever written. And it's completely ignored. We did a beautiful longitudinal model in there where we incorporated age. We were basically looking at how the probability of whether or not somebody who is using mental health services was in or out of juvenile justice. And we integrated these 2 huge administrative data sets in the state of Tennessee, their juvenile justice data set and their public mental health data set. And we found, yes, out-of-home treatment actually does help prevent kids from going into juvenile justice, but only during the time they're in out-of-home mental health treatment and with really tiny effects. But that actually it's the opposite, that going in juvenile justice, they get basically getting arrested dramatically increases the chance of out-of-home treatment. And actually out-of-home treatment being used as a response to, rather than a treatment of juvenile-related problems. We also found drastic differences at age 18 and 19, depending on the year, in terms of kids' probability of being arrested, meaning actually kids are making choices after they turn 18 to either be more cautious with their behavior or to engage in different behaviors. And that's not a message that I think a lot of people really want to hear, right? That if you have harsher treatments, that people are gonna offend less, but that's what we found. So anyway, I thought the modeling was beautiful here. There was tons of I thought it was so interesting showing the out-of-home treatment doesn't really work, but why? So why are we doing it?
The finding was 4 years of out-of-home treatment prevents maybe 1 criminal charge.
Yes,
I mean, that's
super tiny, right? And zero attention. And a lot of that is our own fault, right? I didn't package the abstract in a way that made it sort of interesting for people to read. Oh, and we also found that youth in counties that had high proportions of BIPOC youth were more likely to be referred to supportive services like drug treatment, substance use treatment. But if the proportion of BIPOC youth was small, there was a lot more racial and ethnic disproportionality going on. So if there's a small proportion of BIPOC youth, white youth were way more likely to be referred to substance use treatment. So they were being diverted out of the system, out of the juvenile justice system, while Black youth were being diverted into the system or sent into the system. Again, no attention to this, but
Right. So it was like beautiful example of structural racism.
Yeah. Yep.
In the research. Yeah. Well, those are great answers. And we will make sure that we have links to those papers in the show notes so that people can cite your really wonderful work here.
Well,
Okay.
they'll keep citing the rural one probably.
Yeah, well, because you packaged it well, right? And that's how we should be writing papers, is to
Yeah.
maximize maximize the citability of them
Yes.
and minimize how much people actually read them carefully. That's
Yeah.
my goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now on for our quiz. Now, a lot of our listeners might not know, but Mike, you were really into rock climbing. So I have a
Yeah.
quiz for you on rock climbing. I've just taken this straight off the internet. I have not fact checked this at all. And the prize for you is going to be, well, it'll be a surprise for all of us, because I don't know what the hell the prize is going to be.
I want
I've
an
already
out of
written you
office
a
message.
All right. All right. I had something else in mind, but yes, I will. The prize for you is going to be an out of office message generated by me. Okay. First, now a lot of people may or may not know that climbs are rated or graded in terms of difficulty. Mike, what was the first rock climbing grading system ever used?
Ooh, I do not know the
Okay, I
answer
have
to that.
multiple choice answers for you. Was it the
Okay.
B scale, the UIAA scale, the Yosemite Decimal System, or the Benesch scale? Benesch, Benesch scale.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm familiar with some of those, but I don't know which is first. I've never heard of the Benesch scale, so let's go with
Mhm.
that one.
Wow, congratulations. You are correct. The Benesch scale
Nice.
has 7 levels of difficulty, with level 7 being the easiest and level 1 being the most difficult.
Oh wow, that would
This is
not work
named,
very well because then you have to go negative. You should always know, like it should go in ascending order as people get better and better. So
you
yeah,
should tell that to NIH, Mike.
that's why Benesch shouldn't work. Yeah.
Yeah, in 1894, the Austrian mountaineer Fritz Benesch introduced the first known grading system for rock climbing. Okay, so you got 100 points for that one. Fantastic. Okay, at what point does bouldering become highballing? And if you could explain to our audience what the difference is between bouldering and highballing.
Yeah, good question. Highballing is basically bouldering, so you're climbing without ropes, like low to the
Mhm.
ground, and usually you have pads on the ground. But highballing is when you're climbing so high that like if you fall, like you're gonna really hurt yourself or die. And so it's basically there's a fine line between highballing and free soloing. I don't know that there's an official like line for highballing.
How many feet would you say?
I'm gonna guess 20 feet.
All right. Now, according to the internet, I got 15 feet, but
Okay.
there was an acknowledgement that it's sort of iffy, and it is that difference between injury, and the risk of injury and risk of death. So I'm going to give you a strongly agree for that one. Congratulations. You're doing great so far. You're
Nice.
two
All
out of
right.
two.
All right.
Who was the first person to free climb El Cap?
Oh, to free climb. Oh, that's Lynn Hill. And it's awesome too, because she's a woman, which is
Mhm.
awesome, and she's short, right? There's all these things. And so I think she now announced it goes, boys. That's what she said, because all these men had been trying to do it for so long.
Oh, that's
And then
great.
she went out, and then the other thing, people are like, "Oh, tall! It's so much better if you're taller, easier to climb." And she
Mhm.
showed it wasn't. I mean, she's like 5'4" or something.
Mhm.
But yeah, she's incredible. She's such an awesome, awesome person. Yeah.
That's a great answer. Yeah. So according to the internet, while Warren Harding, along with Wayne Mary and George Whitmore, were the first ever to climb El Cap using aid techniques, and Alex Honnold was the first to free solo it, Lynn Hill was El Cap's first free ascensionist.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. So hang on, what's the difference between free climbing and free soloing?
Yeah, free climbing, you use the rope, but to protect you in case you fall.
Okay.
But you never actually hang on the rope, and you don't actually pull on any gear like bolts. You're only using
Okay.
the rock for climbing, and everything else is just for safety.
Okay. Oh, very
Yeah.
cool. Okay, I like this one. In what type of climbing would one experience the screaming barfies?
I would guess that would be ice climbing or something in really cold, like mixed climbing, where you have like your hands on really cold rock.
And why is it called the screaming barfies?
Well, I think one can figure that out, but your hands get so cold and numb, and you're just like, ugh, like it's just nasty. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I forgot to rate you for the El Cap. You got 1,000 feet for El Cap. I think I'm going to give you that one. And I'm going to give you a very uncomfortable for the screaming barfies, because
Oh,
that's how
wow,
I feel
nice.
thinking about the screaming barfies. All right. What is a monkey fist in the world of rock climbing?
Oh, wow. So I don't know how to tie this, but it's a type of knot, and people will use that when they like Nobody does this anymore, I don't think, but they'll use that, I think, like when they want to throw the rope somewhere
Hmm.
because you can tie it up into this huge ball, like a
Mm.
baseball, and then kind of
Mhm.
chuck the rope. Yeah.
That's perfect, Mike. You've gone. I don't even know how many I've given you, but you're 100% on our quiz. So
Yeah.
I will record the next time you need an out of office message.
Man,
This
I am
is
so
really
glad this
fantastic.
wasn't a methods or analysis quiz because I wouldn't have gotten anything right.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked me about something I know about.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, we have a bonus question. What's the difference between a sandwich estimator and a typical multi-level model?
I think that a sandwich estimator you usually do around between 11:30 and 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon.
In the United
Um,
States. Now, the
yeah,
Spanish sandwich estimator is much later in the evening,
yeah,
or
that's
much
right.
later in the
Versus
afternoon, I mean,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. Versus a typical multi-level model is something that you would do while playing Donkey Kong.
Perfect. Wow, man, so 110%. All right, we're just about out of time, Mike. This has been fantastic. To finish out, who are some shout outs to some special people in your work or personal life that are not, the difficulty here is you cannot mention Brian Weiner.
Oh man, I just want yeah, I mean everyone I work with, Aaron Lyon and Eric Bruns and obviously not Brian Weiner and Shannon Dorsey. I love hanging out with you, Kevin. Yeah, all of those people. And I definitely want to give a shout out to like my early mentors. So Nancy Perrin, who was my stats teacher when I was getting my master's degree, Nancy Koroloff, Barbara
Yep.
Friesen, and Craig Ann Hefflinger. Like they've all been really huge influences in my life and my career. Yeah.
Awesome. And mention any social media where people can reach you if you want.
Yeah, I'm on X at that IS podcast. And then I guess I should be on Blue Sky soon because you sent me an invite, but I haven't gone
Sent
to
you an invite
since.
code. We got to
Yeah,
get on. All right.
yeah, yeah.
Thanks a lot, folks. This has been a fantastic interview with Dr. Michael Pullmann from the University of Washington. Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast. I hope you'll get a chance to listen to us sometime. We've gotten really good feedback. We have dozens of listeners and super fans out there.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks so much for listening. If you liked today's podcast, post about it on social media, like, subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues, or ponder the unintended consequences of the fact that you just wasted an hour of your precious life listening to this show instead of doing something more productive, like watching old episodes of Webster. If you didn't like today's show, I encourage you to go engage in some highball bouldering. I'm on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter at ThatISPodcast, and Kevin is at KMKing_psych. All of the comments and opinions expressed during today's show are our own. They are well-reasoned and insightful, and therefore are probably not endorsed by our grant funders or employers. Thanks for listening. On behalf of Kevin King, we'll catch you next time.
Let's do that again because I want to make that funnier.